I'm a lawyer, and I happen to like being one. Strange, I know. I also know that for some of you, when you hear the words law or lawyer, you feel instantly bored and sleepy. I don't blame you, especially because I've just had to follow the stage from one of Burma's best b-boys, apparently, and he was great. And after all, laws are just voluminous pages of written words. Words so full of intricacies and nuances that you need people who are especially trained to decipher their meanings. But also hidden amongst the little black letters of the laws are stories and histories of ordinary men, nations, and empires. When I first started trying to unearth the history of my birth country, Myanmar, it was the laws that offered me a window to the soul of a country that I had left as a young child. And in those laws, I discovered a country which has had a tumultuous history, with laws that told tales of sorrow and oppression. A country where the law was used as a sword to prosecute and silence, rather than a shield to protect and defend. So today, I want to make the case that as Myanmar turns a new chapter in its history, we need laws that protect the fundamental rights, freedom, and dignity of the people, rather than laws that penalise, punish, and restrict. It's time to reimagine what the rule of law means for this country and all of its people. It's time for the law to be used as a shield rather than a sword. So when I decided I wanted to be a lawyer at the wise old age of 18, I had many reasons. I loved reading and writing and words. I loved words. I also had a strong sense of justice, I thought, but sometimes taken a little bit too literally, as my younger and naughtier brother would say. In my idealistic young mind, the law was a tool to fight tyranny and injustice and to right the wrongs of the world. It was partly because I knew that in one corner of the world lies Myanmar, my birth country, full of people who shared my heritage, but who were subjected to many injustices. But when I actually became a lawyer, the reality was much more boring than that. I worked as a lawyer in a large international law firm, and I specialised in corporate mergers and acquisitions. So the laws that I read told me tales of strict timelines, mandatory disclosures, and reporting requirements. The idea of using the law to slay dragons and fight injustices was long forgotten in the rush of deadlines and transactions. Burma, too, was a distant memory. It was the land of the sunshine and the palm trees and the tinkly temple bells, as Rudyard Kipling called it. But it was also a land where the law seems too opaque and the injustices too deep to fathom. That changed in 2012 when Aung San Suu Kyi was released from house arrest and started giving speeches on rebuilding the rule of law in Myanmar. So suddenly, the land of the sunshine and the palm trees didn't seem so impenetrable anymore. It had a legal system and laws and procedures for a system of justice that needed to be rebuilt. So I set about doing what lawyers do best. I read what I could find on the laws of this land. And what I discovered were some startling revelations about the law and its role in this country's past and present, which gave me a strong conviction that this country's future needs laws that allow people to thrive, prosper, and grow. See, the laws of this land have never truly reflected the people they were meant to serve. The modern legal system of Myanmar was built by a patchwork quilt of governments. It was first introduced in the late 19th century by the British colonial administration, which imported wholesale into Burma laws written for their Indian empire. The baton was then passed to an elected government after the country gained independence in 1948. But from 1962 onwards, various one-party authoritarian governments allowed the legal system to decay. And it was only in 2016 that another democratically elected government came to power again. So if you add it all up, it's really only about 14 out of the last 120 years when the laws of this land have been made by a legislature that represented the population with the democratic system of government. The vast majority of the laws on the books today have been imposed on the population, for better or for worse. And when laws are not made by a popularly elected government and applied by an independent judiciary, the population is left to the mercy of the laws. The fortunes of ordinary men and women left to laws made up of words in a foreign language they may not understand, or laws that appear benign but are so sweeping in their application that they leave the weak with almost no protection. To give you an example, in the Penal Code of Myanmar today still lies Section 124A, which criminalises sedition, an act of contempt or hostility towards the government. It says in English, whoever by words, spoken or written, or by signs or otherwise, bring or attempts to bring or attempts to excite disaffection towards the government shall be punished. The law was intended to curb anti-colonial sentiments in the British era. Really, it was a law to prevent the colonised from hating their colonisers. But it was also drafted widely to cover any eventuality. Maurice Collis, a British author in the Burma of who also acted as a judge in the Burma of the 1920s, said the law was so wide-ranging that if you used a wink to show contempt to the government, you could be jailed. If you shrugged your shoulders when someone mentioned the government, you could also be jailed. If you attempted to incite hatred towards the government, but nobody got excited or even heard you for that matter, you could still be jailed. But modern examples were even more devastating. One of the most poignant laws that I've read in Myanmar is only 3 pages long, and it was called the Enterprise Nationalization Law of 1963. The law was passed 1 year after a military coup that ousted the elected government of the day. The first operative provision of the law simply says, in Burmese, the government shall have the authority to nationalise any enterprise by issuing a notification. The word enterprise was then defined to mean any group, company, organisation, or sole trader doing trade, commerce, or industry. So it covered everyone with any form of enterprise, from the person selling mohinga on the streets to large international banks. In fact, the law was used to nationalise all of the domestic and foreign banks in the country, all 24 of them. But it wasn't just the banks, it was also the factories of all sizes and companies large and small. Even the Boy Scouts were nationalised. So just like that, in a few simple words, the entire economy of the country was put to death by the law. And some would say, to this day, it has not yet recovered. You see, the trouble is, when laws are made by government with unrestrained, unfettered power, they can be used as a sword to harm rather than to protect the fundamental rights and freedom of the citizens. And when the sword comes down, ordinary people rarely stand a chance. In fact, they are the first to suffer. Their life savings, possessions, dreams and aspirations left to the whim of men carrying the sword, often with only greed for power. The second revelation that I had was that in Myanmar, governments have been vouching to uphold the rule of law for over 50 years, when in fact they've actually been using it to silence the voice of the citizens. Now, the rule of law is one of the most contested terms in legal terminology. Nobody can agree on exactly what it means, but everybody has a vague sense of what it means. So you don't want to be at a dinner party with a bunch of lawyers debating the rule of law. Not fun. But ultimately, the rule of law is the idea of a government that's accountable to the law, with everyone, absolutely everyone, subject to the same laws, which are fair, just, and impartially applied. But as I discovered, the rule of law was a term that had been used in Myanmar by politicians, soldiers, and bureaucrats alike, and its usage has had a chilling history. In 1958, when the military formed an interim government, it used the slogan, "Peace and the rule of law first." That same military overthrew the constitutional system of government just 4 years later. In 1974, the rule of law was used as a justification for placing the capital city, then Rangoon, under martial law following student protests against the existing regime. In 1988, a new military junta came to power after brutally crushing a nationwide popular uprising, declaring that the rule of law was one of his topmost priorities. So the term the rule of law, as it has been used in Myanmar, is not about holding the government accountable to the law or protecting the fundamental rights of the citizens. It was about public security, maintaining order, and protecting the state, often at the expense of ordinary citizens. A case in point was the State Protection Law of 1975. That law is also known as the law to safeguard the state against the dangers of those desiring to cause subversive acts. The law allowed the government of the day to suspend the civil rights of any citizen who was believed to be endangering the security of the state or public security and tranquility. It was used by the government to place Aung San Suu Kyi and many other political activists in detention for decades. Arbitrary detention, which was justified by the state papers as being in accordance with the existing laws and within the framework of the law. Thankfully, this heinous law was one of the first to be repealed by the democratically elected government in 2016. So the rule of law shouldn't be mistaken for rule by laws which are unfair, unjust, and arbitrary. It should also not be mistaken for rule by men who are themselves unaccountable to the law. And this interchangeable use of the term rule of law with law and order and security is not innocent or academic. It's not just a lawyer thing. It has far-reaching implications for how the law and the legal system operate in Myanmar. So that brings me to my final point today and my call to action for every lawyer, lawmaker, and citizen of Myanmar and freedom-loving citizens around the world. For so long, the people of Myanmar have been shackled with laws that treat them as disorderly subjects, troublemakers, and disturbers of the peace. We are a nation of 51 million people who are all dangerous and desiring to cause subversive acts, when in reality, we are no different from every other human society in the world. We're doctors and engineers, students and farmers from diverse ethnic backgrounds. We're warm, generous, and hospitable, even having earned the title of being the most charitable nation in the world. Of course, there will be troublemakers. Every society has them, especially when life is hard and the economic pie is so small, and when laws have only been used as a sword to command and control and restrict. how can you expect people to respect the law or to trust it? But it doesn't mean that every citizen deserves to be treated as a criminal or a potential criminal. The people of Myanmar have only rebelled as a nation when our hearts have been so broken and our spirits so crushed by the injustices of laws and authorities that are meant to protect us, as it happened in 1974, in 1988, and most recently in 2007. So I say it's time to change the laws and the tales they tell. Instead of laws that assume the worst of the people, let the laws assume the best in them. Let the laws give them the freedom and the choices to reach their highest potentials. Let the students decide for themselves what they wish to study, and join student unions if they please, for the best politicians in the world are often born of student unions. Let the comedians make satire and poke fun at the authorities, for that's how you keep them accountable. And let the women decide for themselves if they will marry a man of another religion. It is, after all, the 21st century. And let the farmers decide what they will grow and when, for they have been feeding this country for generations. And let the media report on the most sensitive issues facing this country so that they can help shine a light on its darkest parts. I say, let the citizens of Myanmar be game changers and thought leaders and history makers, and let the law be a shield that protects everyone equally, regardless of race, religion, or ethnicity. So that in 50 years' time, when a lawyer goes to read the laws of this land, she would discover tales of justice and equality in a vibrant, dynamic society, all set against that dazzling backdrop of the sunshine and the palm trees and the tinkly temple bells. Thank you.
Cry every time. I've heard this so many times, I always cry. But I want you to turn sideways. Yes. Don't you love a smart, beautiful woman who can deliver a powerful speech in those stilettos?